Muchas gracias al condado por tenernos aquí. Esta es una llamada que va a estar disponible en inglés y en español, un espacio bilingüe traído para ustedes por la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Sensontle. So this will be a bilingual call. This will be both in English and Spanish, brought to you by the Sensontle Language Justice Cooperative. The English speakers do not need to go into any channels since this will be predominantly done in English. La gente que habla inglés no va a tener que estar en ningún canal, pero la gente que habla español o quiere escuchar la llamada en español puede acceder por ella dependiendo si está en una computadora, se verá como el lado izquierdo. Si está por un teléfono inteligente, se verá como el lado derecho. La interpretación ya ha sido activada, así que si está en una computadora, si va al inferior de su pantalla, verá un globo que dice interpretación. Una vez que esté ahí, puede poner el modo apagado si es bilingüe y puede escuchar ambos, inglés y español, o el modo en español para poder acceder a la interpretación y escuchar y participar en español. Y si están en un teléfono inteligente o tableta, se verá bastante similar, pero tendrán que ir al inferior de su pantalla en el lado derecho, ven unos puntitos que dice más. Una vez que estén ahí, van a dar clic y van a ver interpretación de idiomas. Escogen el español si quieren escuchar esta llamada en español. Finalizado y ya tendrán todo interpretado al español. Si están teniendo algún problema, pueden poner en la función de Q y A o en el chat que están teniendo alguna dificultad y alguna de nosotras podremos asistirle. Thank you so very much to the county for having us here once again in English and Spanish. Y pues muchísimas gracias al condado.
Thank you very much. Avril?
Thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Avril Pinder, County Manager here in Buncombe County. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this workshop, and thank you for your interest in the local fiscal recovery funding opportunity. The local fiscal recovery funds are a small portion of the larger American Rescue Plan. Over the last year, we experienced over 18,000 cases and lost over 320 lives to the coronavirus. We've lost numerous jobs, business closures, and several other public health and economic impact in our community. The county's allocation of funding is approximately $50 million. This is a substantial infusion of resources into our community. When the act was signed into law, the federal government stated these funds are to help turn the tide of the pandemic, address its economic fallout, and lay the foundation for a strong and equitable recovery. That is also our goal with this request for proposal. We're looking for projects that are aligned with the eligible uses of these funds, but also projects that build the foundation of a strong, equitable, and resilient economy. Given the scale of this funding, it has the potential to be a catalyst for the broader economic impact and to address long-standing gaps and issues in our community. These funds, however, are non-recurrent, so we want to focus and apply them to one-time or non-recurrent expenditures that will create important long-term assets that provide benefits over many years. Again, thank you for being here and for your partnership with the county. I will now turn it over to Tim Love.
Thank you, Avril, for joining us today and providing those opening remarks. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for joining us today. We have a number of folks that are dialing in virtually, and we appreciate you taking the time today with us to hear more about this process. And we look forward to working with you as we move forward. For those that don't know me, my name is Tim Love. I'm our Director of Intergovernmental Relations and Economic Development. And so I'll facilitate the first part of our presentation. And so we'll jump to the next slide, which is our agenda. Before we get started with the agenda, I want to introduce you to some of the folks who are going to be speaking to you today. We'll have a number of presenters, including Don Warren, who's Buncombe County's Finance Director, Rachel Nygaard, who's our Strategic Partnerships Director. We'll also hear from Matt Evans and Sarah Joss, who are members of our team that will be responding to your comments throughout the day. But there's also a number of other people that are here on the call that are helping things run smoothly. Folks like Angela Johnson, Ron Venturella, Heather Halsey, John Hudson, and others. So I want to thank all of them for their support. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So you can see the agenda on your screen. Today we're going to go through a number of items, including our approach for use of local fiscal recovery funds. We'll talk about eligibility, as well as the purpose of the funds, different funding categories, things like that. That said, we really want today's session to be less about us talking and more about hearing your questions and hopefully responding to as many of those as we can in real time. So that'll be our goal. I'd ask that for those that have questions, please use the Q&A feature here in Zoom. And you can go ahead and begin asking questions now, and we'll sort of tackle them as we go. And then hopefully we'll get to them all in this session, but if not, what you can expect from us throughout this process is any questions that we get, we will provide written answers, and those will be published as an addendum to this RFP process. Additionally, you should be aware that this session is being recorded, and so we'll make that recording available through the Fiscal Recovery Buncombe County website. Rachel?
Tim, I'd like to chime in and acknowledge a technical issue that we're working through. What we're hearing is that the number of participants is capped, and many of our attendees are attempting to access the call and are not able to get in. We apologize for that and are trying to do some troubleshooting. You mentioned the call is being recorded, so we're going to make this recording available to everyone. What I'm going to do here shortly is send an email to everyone who registered acknowledging what we're working through and sharing that update. But we will continue with the call for those who are here. And so that we can share the recording with those that didn't make it on the call.
Rachel, thank you for that update. And even after a year and a half of almost exclusively being virtual, we still find new tricks and challenges. But also a good segue. I hope that everyone on the call will recognize that this is a process that no local government has really ever been through, and including us. And so we're taking it step by step, and we're trying to define a process that's transparent, equitable, and that'll ultimately move the needle in our community. We ask that all of you are patient with us as we proceed through this. If there's things that you're seeing that we're not seeing, we invite you to let us know. But this is just one example of that. If we can jump to the next slide, we'll keep going. So what we intended to do with this slide is, before we jump into the RFP process, I wanted to lay some context for the scope of the American Rescue Plan. And I know everyone's heard about it in the news. It's almost $2 trillion in federal relief that'll be coming in lots of different ways. And what we're here to talk about today is what's circled there on the right, the bottom right. So the Buncombe Recovery Funds, which are approximately $50 million. This comes from a bigger bucket, which is right above it, which is the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, of which there's about $360 billion. These funds are allocated for counties across our country, but also to jurisdictions across the country, including all of the municipalities that are in Buncombe County, from the city of Asheville to Woodville. But additionally, and something we're not going to talk about today, but really important, are all those other buckets of funding that you see on the left. We don't have all the answers about these types of funding and would not claim to, but we know they exist, and we're hopeful that we'll get to utilize these funds as time progresses. And so as we go forward, as we evaluate proposals, we're going to be considering these other funding sources to make sure that we're leveraging the funds as best we can. The $50 million is a great resource, but if we can utilize other funds rather than those dollars, we will. And so we just want y'all to be aware of that, and certainly keep your ears to the ground with these resources, because at the end of the day, it's our collective job to work together to leverage as many dollars as possible to improve the lives of residents in Buncombe County. That's our goal. We can now move to the next slide. In terms of the approach, a really exciting opportunity. And so our initial questions were, how do we begin to make decisions about this opportunity? And so a few items that immediately came to the forefront. First, let's make sure that we're aligning to the Buncombe County Strategic Plan. Many of you are familiar with this. If you're not, Buncombe 2025 is a 5-year strategic plan that was adopted last May by our Board of Commissioners. That strategic plan was informed by over 15 public input sessions all across our community, as well as input from the employees of the 1,500 employees of Buncombe County. And so we wanted to make sure that as we think about the 50 million, we're aligning to that strategic plan. That said, we also wanted to make sure that we were cognizant of the things that have changed since we adopted that strategic plan, most namely COVID-19. So as part of that, in April and May, we began a community input process, which included surveys to the broader community, as well as our departments here in Buncombe County. From the community, we received approximately 8,000 responses. From our internal departments, we received almost 100. Wanted to make sure we had that real-time input to understand sentiment in the community. Additionally, though, as we think about this approach, we want to make sure that we're supporting equitable outcomes in our community. We also want to make sure we're working and collaborating with those in the region, but also in the county. So let's understand what other local governments are doing with their funds, make sure that we're not duplicative, and ultimately doing the best for our community that we can. A big consideration for these funds, however, is, as Avril said, these are one-time resources. We're not going to get an appropriation of $50 million every year. So we need to make sure as we're defining projects, we need to consider that, because if we create projects that we can't sustain through operational funding over time, we'll have some challenges moving forward. The nature of these funds, since they are one-time, does lean towards capital projects or one-time expenses. That said, we'll talk more today about what some other opportunities could be that aren't necessarily capital intensive. The bubbles at the bottom are sort of a timeline that I'll walk through quickly. So in March, our Board of Commissioners gathered basically the day after this funding was announced to just talk at a high level about what some of the county's priorities would be. And so that was a public workshop that was held. And the board came up with some ideas, many great ideas. What I would say about those ideas is that all of these preceded any official guidance from the Treasury Department. From there, as I mentioned earlier, in April, May, we went out for community surveys, and I provided some updates there. Great feedback from the community, and we thank everyone that participated. But again, I would state, this is prior to us receiving guidance from Treasury, which we did finally receive in May. 100 pages of detailed information to help guide our process. As a response to that, we thought it appropriate to reach back out to the community as we are today to receive proposals for those that are on the ground, those community organizations that are dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 in our communities, and understand what you think is possible to achieve with these funds. And so that's the purpose of this RFP process. Next slide, please. So we've alluded to the RFP process, the request for proposal process. And so the goals of this RFP are ultimately to get community ideas, which will be awarded in a typical grant fashion to support eligible uses of the funds based on Treasury guidance. This RFP process is open to nonprofits and public organizations who have a principal place of business here in Buncombe County. We have created a limit of 1 proposal per organization at this time, and we are encouraging collaborative applications. So before we move, I want to spend a few moments on this to make sure that we're clear on a few things. So this is open to nonprofits and public organizations, which means it's not open to private businesses. So while we know that, for instance, restaurants have been heavily impacted by COVID-19, we would not expect a restaurant to individually apply through this RFP process. That said, we would expect, just as an example, a nonprofit organization that has an interest in supporting small business or restaurants in our community apply on behalf of that impacted group of restaurants. So that's just one example. I'm not encouraging anyone to submit a restaurant proposal, but you could take that same model to for organizations that serve particular communities to apply on behalf of other communities to then administer a program. In terms of the limit of one proposal per organization, a few things to consider here. First off, we want to make sure that the proposals we're getting are that we're able to sort of follow up on and have the capacity to follow up on. We're also sort of moving through this process, anticipating that we may need to do an additional follow-on round of proposals. The reality is we do not have all of the money from Treasury in hand at this point. And so we're waiting, and we'll continue to evaluate. But at this time, we're asking for one proposal with the potential that there could be additional processes in the future. Finally, collaborative applications are welcome. So, you know, there is a limit to be the primary respondent to entities, but that doesn't mean that you can't be on multiple proposals. So if you're partnering across multiple proposals, that's a good thing. That's what we want to see. And we would welcome joint applications to tackle some of these really challenging issues that we've been facing for a long time, and hopefully can move the needle on with this particular source of funds. We'll now move to the next slide. So the purpose of the funds, I'm just going to tee this off quickly, but then Don Warren will sort of follow up and get into the details of what's eligible. The purpose of the funds is pretty clear as it's articulated by Treasury, and there's really two big buckets, and those are supporting the public health response, but also addressing the negative economic impacts that are associated with COVID-19. And so what we want everyone to be thinking about is, you know, this is about the response, but ultimately it's about moving into a state of recovery where we create a more resilient Buncombe County. That said, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the spirit of these funds comes from the pandemic. So we need to make sure the responses can still show alignment to that COVID-19 pandemic that we've all clearly faced in the past year and a half. But however, we also want folks to be thinking about, now that we're sort of improving and, you know, vaccinations numbers are improving, how do we sort of ramp up and address those negative impacts and talk about recovery? So it's twofold, but I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, or maybe the beginning of the day, I should say, this is about COVID-19 and its negative economic impacts. So with that said, I'm now going to move to the next slide, turn it over to Don Warren, the Buncombe County Finance Director, who will talk to us about eligible expenses and funding categories. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. So the big question is, what can we spend the money on? And as Tim said, there's two categories. So supporting public health response. And within that, the Treasury has given us their interim final rule. So since it's interim, which means not final yet, there still could be changes to this. But for now, this is what we are working under. So prevent and mitigate COVID-19. That is one of the big categories. And as we're talking about preventing and mitigating, that's where you can get into the areas of how can we build the resiliency moving forward, that sort of thing. COVID-19 treatment and medical services, enhancing behavioral and mental health. That could touch on things, substance abuse, anything along those lines, mental health, crisis lines, those sorts of stuff. Support local health, safety workforce, improve the design and execution of health public service or public programs. And then the big one, which is address disparities in public health. So this is one of the big focuses of the US Treasury, is looking at everything through an equity lens. So how can we really help those most impacted by COVID? And how can we help them recover and get to a better place? And on the next slide, this is the second category, which is address negative impacts, negative economic impacts. This is where we can get a little bit more creative, talking about assistance to households. So this could be your homelessness, this could be your affordable housing, those sorts of things, small business and nonprofit support, aid to impacted industries, assistance to unemployed workers, improving efficiency of economic relief programs, and then again, service for disproportionately impacted communities. How can we look at this money through the equity lens? How can we help those communities? And then the infrastructure pieces, so water and sewer infrastructure, and then broadband. And broadband has been touched on widely in the county. I know we have talked about it internally. So that's a big priority. Moving to the next slide, this gives you an example of the allowable projects. In addition to providing the list of eligible categories, the federal government was kind enough to provide us with a lot of examples. You'll see in the RFP, when you look at that, there's a full list of all the examples of allowable projects. And as you can see on this screen, it's a wide range of projects. It's touching all kinds of different areas. So many of you out there will be able to find an allowable project or a program that can fit within these guidelines. And then talking about the RFP, on the next slide, we'll talk about the schedule. This is critical. The proposals are due by July 15th, 2021 at 5 p.m. There's no exceptions to that. So you have to get those in. Now we're holding this virtual workshop today, and then we're going to be accepting questions until June 21st at 8 a.m. And then we're going to provide those responses back to all of you June 25th at 5 p.m. Then, once we receive all the awards, we will have an initial announcement no later than August 31st, 2021. Now that's going to be the initial announcement of awards. Doesn't mean that it's all the awards. So we have until December 31st, 2024 to finalize all of the awards. And then we have until December 31st, 2026 to actually expend the money. So they have to be obligated by December of 2024, but the projects don't have to be completely spent until December 31st, 2026. Going to the next slide, this is something that a lot of you are familiar with, which is our grants portal. We're accepting applications through the Buncombe County Online Grants Portal. You can see the web address there on the right. It is www.buncombecounty.org/apply. There's also a link to the grant software on the county's recovery funding website. And we're going to use this software not only to accept all the applications, but we're going to use it to do our evaluations and rankings. Angelin Johnson will be happy to help you with any technical issues that you may have with the website, or if you just need help getting set up, anything like that. And her email is down there below. At this point, I'll turn it over to Rachel, and she's going to tell you about the important things such as what to put in the scope of your proposals.
Thank you, Don. Before I begin, I just want to take a moment of privilege at the microphone and say thanks to everyone for your interest in this process. And we're just so sorry about the technical glitch that has limited the number of participants that can be with us live. We're already brainstorming about how to try to make sure that this message is available in as inclusive a way as possible to everybody who wants to hear it. With that being said, let's move into the information about the proposal. Once you're in the software, you will find the application with the fields for responses to each of these questions. These are listed in the RFP document itself, and when you're in the software, it's an application form that you'll be able to access. So starting with brief project description, this is a very short field with a limited number of characters, and it's meant to be just what it sounds, a super brief, high-level summary of what your project is all about. Project plan is a place where you'll get to provide more details about your proposal and how it will work. The statement of need and the link to COVID-19 are both important in order for projects to be eligible for funds and to demonstrate using qualitative or quantitative information that you might have the need that your project is proposed to address. Population served, again, you can use qualitative or quantitative information to explain who you will serve. You heard Don mentioning the equity focused. the equity focus within the application and talking about the population that you'll serve, whether it's geography, how many people will receive the benefit or impact of the service, the demographic characters of those who will be served is important to include. Results and evaluation are connected. Buncombe County will be responsible for reporting to the federal government on the performance of each of the funded projects, and this information will help us meet that expectation. It's a place for you to let us know what your organization has in mind that can be measured to explain the impact, and what your organization has in place in order to be able to track and monitor the results of your project. There's a question about equity impact. In this response, we ask you to be as specific as possible about how equity will be addressed by the project. We're asking about project partners, and you will give us information here about any proposed subcontractors, that is, any organizations that you would be sharing funding with or passing funding to, as well as tell us about partners that are other collaborative partners key to the project, even if there isn't a funding sharing relationship. On capacity, this is to help the county ensure that organizations have the needed capacity within your organization to both manage the project and manage the federal funding that comes along with it. The budget section has a form that you can download and complete and upload back into the software when you're through. And there's also a place for a budget narrative. There's quite a bit of information asked about applicants here, and it's important to carefully explain each piece. There's questions on the revenue side of the budget. If you are leveraging or accessing other revenues beyond what you're asking from these recovery funds, it's helpful to reflect that so we can get a big picture of what other possible revenues, either pending or secured, you've got in place for the project. And then on the expense side, there's a place for you to note whether the expenses are capital or operating. And if you've got multiple revenue sources, it's important that you tie or flag the expenses to each of the revenue sources accordingly. That brings us to the last field, which is special considerations. This is an open field where you can use text or file upload to share any other information that you think that might help the county in its selection. If or how to use this field is up to you. Let's talk a moment about review criteria. Projects that will be brought forward in the initial round of awards are those that will be high priority, high impact, equity focused, with a viable project plan and a sensible budget that makes best use of one-time funds. The specific criteria that we will be looking at in that review is the same criteria you just heard me go through in terms of the proposal contents. And we'll revisit them again just briefly. So, amount of funds requested. We expect commissioners to establish a budget of available funds for each category, and the funding awards will need to fit within that. We don't have those categories and those buckets, dollars assigned to buckets yet. And so we don't have guidance on what's an appropriate amount of funding to request. It needs to be sensible. It needs to be in proportion to your amount of impact that your project will be achieving. And then within our overall recovery funding budget of the roughly $50 million. Eligible category projects will be sorted within and buy these categories and will compete against similar proposals. So it's important that you select the category that you think fits best. We do know that projects often have impact across multiple categories, and you can use your narrative in the project plan, or in the results areas, to talk about the way that other categories are impacted, but we'll need you to pick one for the purpose of sorting by that category. Project plan, we're looking for proposals with a clear, reasonable, viable project plan. Statement of need, you should clearly express a need that the project will impact, and that need should have a direct and strong link to COVID-19. The volume of people that you serve and the population should be proportional to that project budget, again, and the population should include those who are most impacted by COVID-19. The amount of results achieved should also be proportional, and the performance measures should be reliable. That is, that you have a way to track them, and you would explain that in your evaluation. You've got effective tracking and monitoring plans for the results. Equity impact, we're looking for proposals that thoughtfully address equity and tailor the results to the communities most impacted by disparities. Project partners, we're looking for authentic partnerships. Capacity, we're looking for groups that have sufficient internal capacity for delivering the proposed project and managing the federal funds. And budgets, we've talked about that a little bit, being sensible, being realistic, being well explained, and proposing a good use of one-time funds, as well as, to the extent possible, aligning and leveraging and making best use of other funding streams, whether they're other American Rescue Plan Act, other local fiscal recovery fund from other local governments, or just other funding sources in general. And with special considerations, we may take this information into account depending on what you share. You might have an urgent time frame, a matching funding requirement, a partial funding idea, or something else that's important that didn't fit in elsewhere. We'll move to tips for a successful proposal, but not spend too much time here, but really just encouraging you to put your proposal on the strongest footing by carefully considering each of the sections that we just reviewed as part of your putting together the proposal, and then thinking about these tips. Being ambitious and creative is really about understanding that opportunities like this for our community don't come along every day, and we want to have a bold impact. That is, let's see, the state's webinar with us used the terms enduring and significant impact, and in order to achieve that, it requires ambitious and creative thinking. We want to think collaboratively and consider multi-organization projects. Working together is a way to create impact at a level beyond what any one organization can accomplish on its own. For example, instead of funding just one organization to do a certain kind of project, what if we could fund an umbrella organization that allows a whole network of organizations to do that kind of project? Carefully look at the list of eligible categories and examples and think about how to make a strong case that your proposed project is a great fit for use of these funds. And remember that the funds are not recurring, so the types of projects that are really going to get noticed are going to have clear one-time costs. It's important that funds be spent within the time frame, so we're looking for projects that are doable and have a good plan. Thinking about that COVID-19 piece, you will be asked to name a harm that was caused by or made worse by COVID-19, and focus your project and its impact on the specific population impacted by that harm. be really specific about quantifiable results. We're looking for high impact projects with measurable results that, like I said, will become part of our performance reporting to the federal government, as well as performance reporting to our own community as we report back how these funds are being put to work. We talked about maximizing and leveraging other funds, always with grant applications being mindful of character limits. Each response has a limited amount of space. Do not feel like you need to use it all up. Sometimes less is more. We understand that we're going to have a lot of information and material to work through in order to give each proposal the time and consideration that it needs to review it for potential funding. And so keeping your proposal concise helps the review team in their work. And then the last note is focusing on equity, which we've already mentioned several times. I will say that Buncombe County is committed to increasing all forms of equity, notably racial equity. If you're watching the news this week, you saw we just had our Board of Commissioners pass a racial equity action plan. But we understand that equity also comes in other shapes and sizes. A question that came up earlier today that will be added to our question list is a definition of equity. So we'll get that information out to you as well. Anyway, we'll be looking for projects that help us move the needle. Back to some nuts and bolts before we get to our question and answer period. Award schedule. The overall process for Buncombe County's recovery funds is driven by our Board of Commissioners, and they have been regularly meeting about this topic as part of their open public meetings since March, when we first learned about these funds. Their intent is to meet twice more, maybe 3 times more, between now and the end of August on this specific topic. Initially, they'll provide direction on the level of investment or budget per category. Those were those buckets that I mentioned. We'll probably check in with them mid-month and share the list, the initial scoring, before we come back and they meet in late August with the focus on the approval of the initial round of awards. That initial round of awards is expected not to exceed the first half of the funds. We call it a tranche. The first tranche of funds has already been received by U.S. Treasury and is in the county's bank account and available to spend. And that's roughly 25 million. I think it's 25.4 million. We believe that this process accommodates the opportunity to move quickly and respond to pressing needs and pressing opportunities, while also embracing a phased approach that allows us to work with departments and work with community partners over time to ensure that our portfolio of investments sets us on the strongest footing possible for an equitable recovery. So more information, please follow along with our process at buncombecounty.org/recovery-funding. We will publish all of our materials there. We are going to send this recording of this session out as soon as we can, along with a copy of the slides from today. And next week, we'll make sure that it's published on this website so that anyone in the public has access to the info. And we will, when we publish our question responses, they'll be on this website. So that's one to bookmark and follow along.
So we have reached the point of the question and answer, and what we are trying to do is direct everyone to use the Zoom Q&A if you can, and if you haven't already, we've got some really good questions that we're going to get into. I'm going to point out some key dates that we've already talked about. So you have until 8 a.m. June 21st to submit questions. Make sure you follow the instructions that are on this slide that will be shared with you. And then we will be posting an addendum by June 25th at 5 p.m. So to get into the questions, the first one we have is, Within the RFP's eligibility category, services for disproportionately impacted communities, what criteria will be used to determine whether services provided are to other households, businesses, or populations disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 public health emergency? Would new construction that meets the county's definition of affordable housing be an eligible use of these funds, even if the development is not located in a QCT? This is a very specific question, one that we will address in the actual, all these questions will be addressed, but this is one that's very specific. I can break this down if you would like me to, Rachel or Don.
Yeah, what I'll say is that you're correct, Matt, that we're going to type responses to every question that we receive during this call today by email or through any other format, and we want to direct people to our published answers as the official answer, and those will be published by next Friday, a week from tomorrow, June 25th. But in shorthand, in the category services for disproportionately impacted communities, if you dig into the material from the U.S. Treasury, you do see this instance of QCT, Qualified Census Tract, being referred to. And that's a method that the federal government has given local communities to identify neighborhoods within their county or within their jurisdiction that would be eligible. What we have learned is it's not the only way to become eligible. So that's sort of, they've given it to local communities as a way to save time and sort of have categorical eligibility, but there are other ways if we can demonstrate need to do that. So we'll take a look more closely and see if we can get more technical on that answer, but briefly, we have more flexibility than just QCTs.
So the next questions, we have a couple questions about multiple projects. Can an organization apply for multiple projects in their one application? And for organizations who serve multiple populations, can the proposal make requests for multiple projects?
I'll take an attempt at that and then see. There was another piece that we haven't discussed as a team, so that we may have to hold it. So we know that we're limiting groups, organizations, to one proposal per organization. One piece of that you asked, Sarah, was, can it have multiple parts? Yes, projects can certainly have multiple parts. It's important that they be related enough under one project proposal so that there's a description that works across all of the components and that there are measures that can convey the project success. But you know, if an organization is working to use more than one approach as part of the same project, that's fine. You also asked about participating in more than one project. A group can be the lead applicant on one, but partner on another. That's fine, as long as they're only submitting one. The question I saw in the chat was if if an organization is serving as fiscal agent for another organization, does that use up their one proposal? The strict reading of that would be one proposal per organization, and that, yes, it would disallow them from submitting a second proposal. But I'm looking at Don and thinking that's not something we've talked about as a team, and we may need to circle back on.
Yeah, we would definitely need to revisit that and just make sure we're providing the correct information.
Yeah.
So one thing to add before we jump into further questions, we're working with the best information that we currently have. The Treasury has released an interim rule. So we kind of have that as our guidance right now. A lot of these questions seem to be Buncombe County process questions, and we're well versed in that, but we will have next week to work through that stuff. So more questions. If subcontractors have not yet been identified, Would describing the process for subcontractor vetting and responsibilities and subcontracting requirements be adequate?
Certainly. Some organizations have bidding processes, and so you can't know who your partners are going to be. But if you've got some already identified, we would ask you to communicate those.
Great. And then also regarding applicant roles, it looks like folks had some questions, just clarifications on submitting proposals individually versus being involved in more system-wide or collaborative proposals, and how you would like them to establish that in the RFP process.
Every proposal will require a lead entity, and that's the organization whose name the proposal is going to come in under. And at this point, it's one per. But there is a place in the application to list partner organizations. So if a group is working in that sort of system or umbrella capacity and supporting multiple partners, or if it's a collaboration co-designed by multiple partners, that partnership section would be the place to make sure that you elaborate on that, as well as maybe also in the project plan.
Great. And then regarding fiscal sponsorship, does the one proposal per organization guideline exclude community groups who would apply through a fiscal agent if that fiscal agent organization is already submitting a proposal of their own?
We will take that question and give it some more thought. Initially, we don't have any exceptions. At this time, I guess I would say we don't have any exceptions allowing organizations to submit more than one.
And there was another question about fiscal sponsorship. If an organization agrees to be a fiscal sponsor for an organization in the process of getting tax exempt status, does that still mean there can only be one proposal per organization? Or could the organization be a primary applicant and also a fiscal sponsor for another organization?
Same answer. We need to evaluate that, determine if there's going to be an exception to the one applicant rule.
It's a more direct question. Will there be more than one RFP released? Potential reasons: not enough applications received to invest all dollars, or the 5-year window provides the opportunity for future services to come online that don't currently exist and therefore can't apply.
Yeah, I would foresee that we would have more than one, especially since we're getting the money in 2 tranches. So we are going to be planning to award the $25 million that we have received. And then we'll more than likely have another process and go through this again for the second set of funds that come to us. There's a possibility that we could have another process for this first tranche, but there will be another one.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the way that you point out that there's things that we don't yet know is certainly true, and it's been part of our conversations here at the county. We don't yet know exactly what the needs are going to look like a year from now, and we don't yet know what is going to happen with some of these other funding sources that are flowing down to our community. And we also don't yet know what some of the service opportunities are going to look like. So at this point, we may release another RFP. It may be open or it may be tailored. And organizations that don't get awarded in the initial round of awards won't necessarily have to reapply for that project, because we'll already have that. And the intent would be that Buncombe County can stay in communication, maybe gathering more information from, and working with those applicants until the next round of awards. So likely initial RFP rounds, likely initial award rounds.
And
We have another question. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Can you talk about the timeline for projects? For example, would a 48-month project that ended by December 2026 be appropriate, or are you looking for shorter term projects?
As long as we obligate the funds by December 31st, 2024, and they are spent by December 31st, 2026, the project would be fine. I would think, given the excitement that the commissioners have, that we do want to get some projects done and moving as quickly as possible. So shorter term projects, longer term projects, we hope to have a good mix when we finally do the awards.
More questions on award and spending timelines. I think these are good questions to keep hitting. Can you clarify the spending deadline for grants that are awarded in the first round?
Regardless of the, well, based on the interim final rule that we have right now, the rules are December 31st, 2024 to be obligated and to be spent by December 31st, 2026. I'm gonna keep saying those dates. They're critical as of right now. So even if it's awarded in this first go round, those are still the dates.
So can the timeline for proposals from this initial RFP extend through 2026, or is there a different timeline expected?
As we talked about potential for future RFP processes, it would be a new process. We would not extend the deadline for this one.
We know that there are some projects that are ready to go that are in need of some funding that seem eligible for use of these funds. And there's a desire on behalf of Buncombe County to move quickly. But it was really important to us to establish a process where any group could submit ideas so that they can be, that there aren't any ideas that get to the front of the line, that all proposals are being reviewed similarly. And we also know that there are going to be some additional, there will be some short-term right-of-way things, and there will be some long-term projects. But Dawn is right. The time frames that we're operating under are those from Treasury of 2026, having all funds fully completed.
Do we have any thoughts on, do funds have to be spent within 1 year period, or can the scope of your project span multiple years?
Oh, absolutely. You can have a project that spans multiple years. Again, the critical dates, obligated by 2024, December 31st, 2024, and they have to be fully expended by December 31st, 2026.
So can you speak to the requirement to include costs incurred no earlier than March 3rd, 2021?
Yes. If you have a project that is, I guess, you would be working on currently or prior to the award of these monies, you would only be able to pick up the expenditures back to that date when the stimulus package actually became law. You could not go back prior to that, and that is going to be based on Treasury guidance. So if that changes, we would let people know, but we have to work within what the guidance has. So that's where we're at right now.
Question with multiple. So what is the process for disbursement after a successful award? How long will it take? Are these funds being dispersed on a reimbursement-based system or in advance of project expenditures?
I'll attempt to speak to that one. Our process with Buncombe County is once an award has been made, we enter into a contract negotiation period. So there are some things that are always in the county contracts that we would walk the vendor through, and some of that is outlined in the RFP, like required insurances and that kind of thing. And then there are pieces that are in the contract that are decided each time unique for that project. And that's around the scope of work and the fiscal provisions. So a payout schedule is something that is going to be really important to talk about. Is your project something that is very heavy with upfront, or does it have equal costs over time? Is a reimbursement basis feasible for your project, or do you need to have a request to have some funding sent up front and then tracked and accounted for after the fact? We have different options built in to our contracting structures, and so we don't want to offer any blanket statements about what the fiscal provisions would look like or what the scope of work would look like, but we know that as federal funds, there are some things that will not be negotiable. The contracts will be treated as federal subrecipients and subject to federal subrecipient monitoring. So the level of documentation and the level of inspection of that documentation will be at a really high or enhanced level. But there are some pieces that can be negotiated per project. I saw Don's face squint a little, so I hope he agrees with what I said.
I do. I was reading another question. Sorry.
Phew.
All right, this is a fairly specific question. Would seeding a scholarship program be allowable with this money?
What I'll say about is that particular activity allowable, or is any other particular activity allowable, is that right now there are some, we're looking at these funding categories and we're looking at these example, what do they call it on the sheet?
Examples of allowable projects.
Examples of allowable projects. What they're telling us is that this is not an exhaustive list, which means it can be tricky to make a determination with 100% certainty with what we have right now as to whether a particular service is allowable or not allowable. Some areas are very clear and some areas are less clear. We would encourage you to look through the materials that are available and make a determination if you think it makes sense, make the case that it fits, and go ahead and get it submitted. We've got a long list of specifics that we're researching, and at this point don't have the ability to make those determinations on a service by service level for you.
Are there salary restrictions? For example, a percentage of the total requested funds. That may be a question for Buncombe County and not for Treasury.
We would have to discuss that one to determine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we didn't put any limitations on that in the RFP. So at this point, it needs to be reasonable. Some projects are going to be heavier on personnel than other projects. We know that it needs to fit within federal uniform guidance, and so depending on if it's a direct salary or an administrative salary, we may need to take a closer look at the percentages, but at this point there are no specific restrictions on salary or on admin.
Yeah, we're trying to stay within the flexibility that the U.S. Treasury has put out. So we have not talked about specific restrictions on projects and programs or anything along those lines, other than what is allowable and what is not allowable, and then following federal guidelines. So I would encourage people to be creative and make sure that it ties back to COVID and disproportionately serves communities. And I don't want to discourage anybody from giving us a proposal.
And this might have a similar answer. could funds for a mental health nonprofit be used to pay for therapist salaries, or must it be used for a new project or initiative?
I do not see a restriction showing that this is only for projects or initiatives that didn't exist. So there may be a way to tailor your work in a way that matches the criteria and not have it be a new project.
Is assistance for Black citizens wanting to purchase property for ownership an option?
Home ownership and affordable housing are specifically mentioned in the section around services for disproportionately impacted communities. The structure, we'd have to think through it. You mentioned individuals. Obviously, individuals aren't eligible to apply, but we do encourage groups that serve those individuals to put together proposals on their behalf.
What are QCTs and how can I learn more about this?
QCTs are mentioned in the table that lists eligible categories and examples of allowable projects. They're specifically mentioned in the category for services for disproportionately impacted communities. It stands for Qualified Census Tract. It says that funds may be used for certain services when provided in a QCT or to other households, businesses, or populations disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 public health emergency.
Slightly different than the last question. Could the funds be used to acquire property provided that the purpose of the acquisition meets the criteria you outlined?
I suppose if you were possibly. How's that?
I mean, Dawn, what I would say is going back to it's tricky for us to with certainty fill in X, Y, or Z and tell you that something is definitely eligible or definitely ineligible right now. Anecdotally, I'm reading blogs and articles and other information about these funds, and there's a lot of talk by local communities about property acquisition. And so whether that would be property acquisition by the government itself, funding a community partner to acquire property for the purpose of affordable housing, there seems to be some interest in doing that with these funds.
That's what I said, possibly.
Could projects be funded at a lower or partial amount than what is requested?
Don, possibly?
Possibly. It really will come down to what the commissioners determine they're going to fund, how much they're going to put towards each category. And that could require a proportionate share of funding to a project. We would hope that if somebody is proposing that if it is a dollar amount that is negotiable, let's say, that we would know that, so that in the event that we have to reduce awards, that we don't drastically impact a project or cause a project not to happen. But it's really going to come down to what the commissioners want to fund.
I agree. The only other part that I would think to add to that is that in the case of a partial award, we would commit to working with the organization that submitted that proposal to determine if the project is feasible and what changes would need to be made in order to match the amount of funding being offered.
We understood that some of this funding was considered to be a BOCA fix. for addressing the diminished federal VOCA federal funds until, and this is VOCA, can be replenished in 3 to 5 years. Can a one-time, quote unquote, project be can a one-time project be serving crime victims over 3 years?
The answer to the second part of that question is yes. We talked earlier about multi-year projects, and so it can deliver, a project can deliver services over, at this point, it could be up to about a 5.5-year period and be within time frame. However, I don't have any knowledge of the Victims of Crime Act connection. We'd have to research that, but I don't know that that's necessarily tied to the piece of the question that I answered, but we'll make a note to look into it.
And as the county is considering having more than one grant process, do you have guidance on whether to submit a 5-year application, or one-time larger funded project, which is harder to predict, or a shorter time frame project?
That's a strategy question, and so it's tricky for us to say what's going to work best for your organization. But when you look at all of your projects and potential projects, really trying to see what rises to the top for you in terms of a need and an opportunity, and the sort of the, again, that word of viability. What do you have readiness to take on, and what's going to make the biggest difference in terms of helping us get to an equitable recovery?
So if you were declined for the first process, is there a possibility to apply again?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. There's the possibility to apply again. Short and simple, yeah.
Yep, every grant process and every RFP process that we operate stands alone.
And going back to those collaborative applications, will all partners receive funding from a collaborative application, or how will the funding work for those?
Depends on what's proposed, I think. I've heard anecdotally of a few different ideas where there would be pass-through funding, and it's really up to the proposal to explain how it would work. And I would imagine that a business program would look really different from a housing program, would look really different from an education program.
Does capacity building, specifically onboarding contractors as salaried with benefits staff for an existing program, fall under the criteria of this allocation?
We'll make a note of that question and take a look. Again, we may not be able to research it and give you a specific definitive answer between now and when the applications are due. That's one that I haven't specifically looked for.
Can admin and overhead be included in the budget proposal?
Well, Rachel, what is our standard as far as overhead? You're the grants guru here.
We don't have a standard requirement for organizations that we work with. So again, we're looking for budgets to be reasonable and sensible and practical. We don't have a percentage that will apply to applications as far as the standard scoring for admin. Again, we just need to make sure we're in compliance with all of the federal guidance on use of funds.
Are you interested in working collaboratively with the city COVID funds in a large project such as a high access shelter?
We are interested in working collaboratively with other partners, including other local governments that have the access to the same kinds of funds. The state of North Carolina got about $5 billion in coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. City of Asheville got some. Every other town within Buncombe County, and many of our neighboring local governments and regionally. So we're definitely open to collaborative proposals. Public organizations are eligible to submit if one of those partners wants to be the lead on submitting a proposal, as are the community-based organizations. So we can imagine scenarios where the same project goes to multiple organizations for consideration simultaneously. And the one that you gave as an example was related to sheltering. Homelessness is one of the topics that we've heard from both homelessness and affordable housing came out as high priorities by both the Board of Commissioners and the community when we surveyed about top needs.
Could these funds be awarded through extension of an existing contract with the county?
We're wrinkling our faces and thinking through that, which means it's a good clue to us to probably write that one down and not try to answer it just now. We'd have to think through how that would be structured.
Are indirect expenses allowable? If so, is it possible to include indirect costs on a percentage basis in the proposal?
That would go back to Rachel's answer about administration and overhead.
Matt, we just talked in the grants team earlier today about indirect costs. Is any of that relevant here?
I think what we do is we take this question, we put it in there, and we'll put some good information that accompanies it.
That's fair. Thanks.
And I think that we already addressed this one. Is there an allowable admin overhead percentage to be aware of? And if so, do we have any specific percentages?
So we'll direct people to look for the official question and answers when they come out next week. Between now and then, we're giving consideration to all of these questions, and that's one that we're definitely going to revisit.
Is the RFP open to early childhood education initiatives in regards to employee retention dollars, equipment and materials, transportation upgrades, and capital outlays for slot expansion?
Education does appear in the eligible categories. I believe that early education appears.
They talk about new, expanded, or enhanced early learning services, including kindergarten programs and Head Start.
Yep, that was given as a for example in the services for disproportionately impacted communities. And some of the examples of types of expenses that you would include sound like ones that we've seen in these materials. It's hard to specifically go through your proposed list of items. But from a general perspective, we know that both childcare and early learning have been named.
It looks like we're getting down to our last couple questions. So if folks have any last burning questions to add to the Q&A, this would be the time to do it. One of the last questions is, do populations served need to be specific and exclusive to Buncombe County residents, or are regional projects able to apply for these funds?
We have a limit about an organization's eligibility. Their principal place of business needs to be within Buncombe. Don, I started at the same time as you, so no. you take the services part.
I'm sorry, say again?
Do you want to answer the services delivered part?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. You know, it needs to be located in Buncombe, but there is opportunities for regional projects. In fact, if Tim Love was still here, he would be telling us about a Land of Sky meeting that's going to be going on to talk about collaborative projects. And I wish I knew the specifics of that because I could share that with y'all, but we will get that out to you in the questions and answers as well.
In our past experience working with organizations that serve more than a region that's bigger than just Buncombe County's region or jurisdiction, we work with them to come up with ways to track so that services and expenses can be differentiated between Buncombe County and the rest of their area. Buncombe County government needs to spend these funds on services for Buncombe County, but we also see the benefit of regional projects.
So this is the last question we have currently. For capital projects, what is your current criteria for readiness and viability?
Well, I know when we talked, what was it, 2008, 2009, about the ARA money, shovel ready was a big deal. There hasn't been any language really about shovel ready at this point, but from our perspective, we would want the projects to get done as soon as they possibly could. Now we understand that there will be multiple year projects that will be proposed, but ideally, I would not think that we would want a project that is going to wait until 2026 before it will kick off and try and be finished in that same year.
I think much of it will depend on the specific proposal. You know, capital projects can be very complex and have a lot of phases. Capital fundraising, property acquisition, bidding, working with your different vendors that manage different components of it, acquiring goods. And if you present a project plan that is reasonable and demonstrates that it can be accomplished within the time frame, that's what's most important.
We did have one more question come up, and this one might again be I use your best judgment, but would creating a publicly accessible nature reserve in an area where such natural environments are lacking provide sufficient connection to COVID, considering clean air, stormwater mitigation, and outdoor activity benefits?
There's some language related to air and water projects.
I think it's under the water and sewer infrastructures where they talk about clean water and.
Yep, we've got some links on buncombecounty.org/recovery funding where you can dig a layer deeper than what we've given you just in the RFP. And there's a link to the NACO analysis of the U.S. Treasury's interim final rule, and they've provided some eligible uses of water and sewer related category funding aligned to the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which I'm saying their names because that opens up a set of other categorical eligibility that they're adopting for the purpose of these funds, and that would be something to take a closer look at.
Another question popped up, and I'm assuming this would have to be related. Are startup nonprofits eligible?
I think that it
would be the definition of a nonprofit has to meet the specific guidelines that are outlined in the U.S. Treasury guidance. And we can provide that information as well.
Yep, we have. In the RFP under eligibility, there's a footnote that directs you to a definition of nonprofit. So an organization would have to have already sufficiently incorporated. And so they could be early in their startup, but not too early. If they haven't got the eligibility on their own just yet, they would need to either be ineligible or partner with a group that.
So that is it for the questions. Please send them to the link provided in the slide deck. We will have gone through them, published them for you.
So in the way of wrap up, again, please accept our apologies that not everybody was able to get in and be an attendee who registered for today's call. That was an unfortunate technical limitation that we ran into, and we're very sorry about that. Everyone who registered for today's call will get an email as soon as we're able to get the video so that we can send the recording to everybody who registered. And then by next week, we'll publish the full video online. We'll give you guys the slide deck in the email too, and then we'll publish the slides online. And then you've got until Monday. Can you repeat the question deadline, please, Matt?
It's Monday, June 21st, 2021, 8 a.m. And you're going to email those to the email address provided on the slide that we will be sending out. And you're going to put in the subject, RFP Recovery Funds questions.
And that goes to Ron Venturella, who's our procurement manager and is on the line with us today. Staff will gather up all of those questions that are submitted by email. We'll gather up all the questions that were submitted during today's conversation, and we will write them up with responses and publish them on our website no later than Friday the 25th. Sooner if we're able. And Ron's email address is in the chat for you. So thank you everyone for sharing your time with us this afternoon. Thank you for your interest in the recovery funds. This is a really exciting opportunity. We know the stakes are high to do right by this infusion of funds, to move quickly where we're able to move quickly, and to invest through partnership with our community in projects that are going to have that sustaining impact, and help Buncombe County move toward that equitable recovery from COVID-19. So thank you very much for your interest and your participation, and we look forward to staying in dialogue with you as we go forward. Thanks everyone, have a good evening.